engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to The People's Historian, a weekly podcast that takes you on a journey through time with amazing stories from our collective past. Your host, Professor of History and Professional Public Historian, Dr. Gabriel Selassie. What happens in segregated North Carolina in 1958 when a young white girl aged 7 or 8 kisses two African-American boys ages 9 and 7? The famous kissing case is next. What we're about to hear is one of the worst stories in history, particularly of American race relations, that I have ever heard. It will help us to crystallize so much why Black lives matter and why there has been a continued struggle for freedom. Sometime in October of 1958, a young white girl named Sissy Marcus, and she was about 7 or 8 years old, met up with two black boys, one of them named James Hanover and the other one David Simpson. Now, James was about 9 and David was about 7 or 8 years old. Sissy Marcus was a white girl. James and David were black boys. Sissy and James knew each other because it appears that James Hanover's mother might have worked for Sissy Marcus's parents as a domestic. They were living in the town of Monroe, North Carolina. So you know that in the 1950s, we're talking about Southern segregation. Now, James and David were out playing and eventually stumbled over into the white community, and they met up with Sissy Marcus, and because they were familiar with each other, they played with each other. There doesn't seem to be anything insignificant of that, except for the fact that segregation, there might have been some prohibitions of young people playing together. Not many, because on plantations, when slavery was at its zenith, young white plantation owners' children played with the slave children. And they were nursed by, the white kids were nursed by these black female slaves. Well, what turned this whole incident was the fact that at some particular point, Sissy Marcus kissed James and David. Therefore, we have the infamous kissing case. Later on that evening, Sissy Marcus told her mother, Bernice Marcus, that she had in fact kissed the two boys. The mother, Bernice, became so outraged that she called the police and everyone in the local community, the whites in the local community, and told the police and the whites in the area that her daughter had been raped by James and David. Sound familiar? The townspeople got their guns and their arms, and they went looking for the boys. Now, can you imagine grown men with guns searching for 9 and 8-year-old boys? What would have gone through the minds of the parents who would have had no recourse but to either give up their lives or surrender their children? James and David were, in fact, arrested. They were taken to a jail and beaten, coerced into a confession. Attempts at habeas corpus were denied by the police. The parents could not see their children. And what we're getting from the two boys later on, as this unfolded, were that they were beaten severely on their body and not on their face, because that would obviously show marks if somebody walked by the prison cell and saw them. James and David were convicted of molestation and sentenced to reform school until they were 21 years of age. Now, to give this story just some more context, we have to kind of look at what was going on in Monroe, North Carolina at the time period. Today, Monroe has a population of about 30,000, so we can subtract maybe about 10,000 from that, maybe more. It's a small town that sits in Union County, North Carolina, and it is about, I would say, maybe a half hour to an hour southwest of Charlotte. During the time period, there was an immense struggle for civil rights going on in Monroe. And it largely had to do with the idea that black people wanted to swim in the public swimming pool that their tax dollars paid for. A man by the name of Robert F. Williams was the head of the local NAACP, who spearheaded the drive to integrate the swimming pools. And the thesis and the theory here is pretty simple, as I stated, that black people paid their taxes but were denied the right to swim in the swimming pool, the public swimming pool. So what was the issue with that? Well, for the most part, all throughout the United States, young people, especially when it became exceedingly hot, as it is in the South in the summers, would swim in local swimming holes, the local rivers and lakes. The problem with it is that so many of these were dangerous. They were unsupervised. Many kids, both black and white, drowned. So swimming pool construction became a big deal in the 1950s through the 1960s. And there's excellent books on the integration of swimming pools. And they talk about the idea that these pools, particularly throughout the South and, of course, the North, in some instances were heavily segregated. So this is the reason why when you hear things like, well, black people don't know how to swim, and partly this is reference to the fact that black people were excluded from public swimming pools. Now, Robert F. Williams spearheaded this drive to get the pools overturned, and of course that excited the local Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized the black community over this. The entire white community was dead set against black kids swimming in pools. Now, if you don't know anything about segregation, segregation wasn't a child of the South. It was actually born in the North, where there were few black people who lived amongst white people in the North, and so things just were generally segregated. If you did have black people in some areas in the North, at some particular times, particularly in the northern territories like Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, black people were, in many cases, sometimes segregated out of certain places of living, certain places to do public business. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the South needed a permanent, dependent class of workers to continue working on those former plantations. They also wanted to ensure that black people would never gain political power in the South, because after the Civil War, black people were becoming Republicans and active in the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party began doing whatever it needed to do violently to make sure that black people did not gain any political power. So segregation was a two-pronged approach. One, to wrest power from black people to ensure that they would be the subservient population, and to instill fear among the black population, establishing second-class citizenship among the black population. And you did this by prohibiting black people from drinking out of fountains, from attending white schools, from even sitting in the same area with white people when you're waiting for a bus. All factors of life were completely segregated. You ensured that black people got poor educations, and then you gave them literacy tests, and because they could not read, they couldn't pass them, and so therefore they couldn't vote. It was a pernicious system. So Robert F. Williams was hell-bent on destroying segregation, and he began with pools in Monroe, North Carolina. Now, the white community, people like writers like Harry Golden, who echoed the sentiment of white people in the town. He was a writer and publisher, and he said that desegregation was unwise because simply whites don't want to associate with black people. That was the basic overall tenor that Robert F. Williams was working in. Now, what is interesting about Robert Williams, there's a really good book written about Robert Williams, and he wrote a treatise as well on, or titled, Negroes with Guns. He argued that black people should just simply arm themselves and fight back. Robert F. Williams was hounded by the FBI, the CIA, etc., and then he eventually was smuggled out of the United States and ended up in Cuba and started a radio station with Fidel Castro that was beamed into the South called Radio Free Dixie. And I think that is the actual name of the book, Radio Free Dixie. But it's a fascinating read on Robert Williams. He was an extraordinary human being. Now, what happened here is that the boys were imprisoned in North Carolina's state reformatory, and they were kind of moved around a little bit because people, of course, weren't naturally going to sit back and allow these two boys to be imprisoned and sentenced for basically a good portion of their lives simply because a white girl had kissed them. The district attorney, the state, the newspapers, the infrastructure, the government agencies in North Carolina, all run by white people, made every effort to paint the boys as delinquents, repeat criminals, that their parents were absentee, their mothers were fired from their jobs, that the boys, if not checked, would be prone to rape white women. And there's this ostensible fear that white people in the South had with miscegenation, hybridity, the idea that blacks and whites would mix and out of it would come a mongrel race that would destroy both races. So the upholding of Southern white womanhood was at play here. Now, the case began to turn because of international condemnation. There was an international committee that was formed in Europe that began to lobby for the release of the boys. A European reporter was allowed to come in to interview the boys. A camera was smuggled in. They took photos of the boys' beaten bodies, and that was publicized in newspapers throughout the world. Eleanor Roosevelt tried to intervene to no avail. And over time, because the European newspapers kept running stories about this racist act, the boys were eventually pardoned by the governor. No apology. Now, whatever you may think about the quest for Black rights, Black Lives Matter. This isn't something that happened in 1850, 1910. This happened in 1958. I imagine that some of you might have been alive, if not your parents were alive, when this actually happened or were born very close during the time period. So it's not like we're delving into some far-off time period about this. This is recent history. The boys are still alive. How damaged were these boys psychologically from having been thrown in jail and repeatedly beaten by grown men who hated them? This case, which really fascinates me because I've spent time looking at the newspaper articles, and if you look at the newspaper articles in the South, they're just absolutely horrible because every indication is that they believed that they were doing something that was right. That in one case, they even stated that the kids were better off in detention because their homes were so bad. But whatever you think about this particular case, it ought to give everyone pause to rethink what America stands for and how we deal with the legacy of racism. Thank you very much for tuning in. I am your host, Dr. Gabriel Selassie of The People's Historian.